set up, I'll just start.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm good to go.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to your 410, right? So we're here today to talk about a really cool project that we have been collaborating on. In case you have never met me before, my name is Vedrana Subotic. I'm the piano faculty here. This is Dr. Sherrill. Is our theory faculty, and together we're going to talk about the new commissions of Balkan folk transcriptions and their contextualize it in terms of modal scales. And would you like to add?
Yeah, well, so as a music theorist, one of the big things that I study is I have kind of a mathematical model of scale structures, and so I use relatively highfalutin math like linear algebra and topology to talk about how different scales work. And in classical music, we don't have a lot of interesting scales to work with. Most classical music tends to use major and minor. If you're a jazz musician or maybe a guitarist of different stripes, you use different modes of the diatonic scale, like Dorian or Phrygian or whatever. But one of the really interesting things about the musical styles that Professor Subotic has commissioned arrangements of is that they come from cultural traditions that use a lot more interesting scalar structures. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit today about some of the cool stuff that's going on that makes these non-Western classical scales really interesting for musical styles to use.
Thank you. So before we get into that, I want to give you a little bit of a context and background on the project itself. So I teach a course here, two courses actually, called a Career Development for Musicians. If you haven't taken it, you might want to look into that. And part of the reason why I thought it would be an interesting presentation for you today is because as faculty members, you really only know us as people who teach you. We teach your courses, we teach your private lessons, whatever you're enrolled in. And as you go through a musical education and you graduate and you're seeking jobs, some of them might be in academia, I think it's interesting to know what faculty actually do when you're not seeing them in the classroom or in your lessons. And while we are here to teach you based on our expertise and our knowledge, the reason why we get hired as professionals at institutions of higher learning is because of our research. So we do specific research that then leads us to acquire knowledge and expertise in our particular fields of interest, which we then together with curricular models that are in whatever school we end up teaching, in this case at the University of Utah, and we combine those two resources into teaching courses and lessons. So if you're getting a job or planning on getting a job at a place such as a university or a college, then you will also be expected to do original research as part of your faculty appointment. And that's one of the reasons why I thought this would be interesting for you, just because you might not know. How many of you knew this? One, two, maybe two. Okay, so a minority, right? Secondly, this is part of my original research and Dr. Sherrill's original research, and it fits very nicely to what we do as teachers here. I myself, as a pianist, have grown up and come from a different country in Europe, now known as former Yugoslavia, and I have been playing a lot of classical music and some new music that is composed in the classical canon, but what really caught my attention over the last few years was sort of the national and cultural identity of my former country, which sits in the area of Eastern Europe called the Balkan Peninsula. And it's an area of Europe with very strong oral folk tradition. It's perhaps most familiar to you through the work of Bela Bartok and Zoltan Kodai, who at the beginning of the 20th century traveled around Eastern Europe and collected various melodies and rhythmic patterns and cataloged them, and that gave birth to the academic discipline of ethnomusicology. It is also a place where still the oral tradition exists, and stories and poems, poetry that has not been written down is told much in the style of what we think happened with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. So this is still a living tradition in this part of Europe, and as such has been of great interest to musicologists. But my own interest in it stemmed from having been immersed in that folklore and folklore musical tradition when I was growing up, as I was studying to be a classical musician. I started my professional studies when I was 5 at the State Conservatory and continued straight through college into academia, and here I am, telling you about my life experience. But I grew up with this music that was everywhere around me, on TV, on radio, in restaurants, street bands. This was just something that I knew as familiar music. And so a couple of years ago, I thought, well, wouldn't it be neat if I could actually play these things on the piano? But I didn't want them just to be melody and accompaniment. I wanted it to be something that would capture the unwritten traditions of improvisation by local musicians from Bosnia, Montenegro, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, etc. People who may not have necessarily been schooled in music literacy, but have developed an ability to play their instruments on a highly virtuosic level, and they improvise and work as musicians in the folklore industry of that part of Europe. So I was really taken by their level of skill, the incredible playing that I heard, and especially the rhythmic intricacies that were woven in the instrumental part of the vocal music. So I ended up commissioning 6 of my favorite childhood songs, what I remembered, and they kind of nicely cover a greater area, such as Montenegro. There's one from Macedonia, there is one from Serbia, there's one from Bosnia, and I also was able to get a transcription of a famous gypsy melody. So that one in particular is interesting to me because it doesn't really belong to a country, right? Gypsies, we think, came from southern India in around 1500s, and they brought with them a very strong musical tradition. As a matter of fact, the word Roma, so have you heard of the word Roma, Romani? That's the word for the gypsy nation. In Sanskrit, it means musician. So it's interesting that they came all the way from India and brought this very strong musical tradition that has pervaded all of Europe and has left a very strong influence. And gypsy musicians tend to combine their native melos with jazz. So there's some very famous jazz groups that are also gypsy musicians, like back in 1970s, before anyone here was born. It was Tsigani Ivanovici, but I don't know if you've heard of Gypsy Kings, or if you're interested in that kind of music.
Before then, there's Django Reinhardt.
Django Reinhardt, yeah, exactly. So, anyway, so that particular song, and I want to make sure that I leave enough time for your theory part of this, is based on what is now a national anthem, national gypsy anthem called Jellum, Jellum, and it means I went. And it used to be just a melody, but in 1944, a Croatian gypsy, Žarko Jovanović, added lyrics to it. And the lyrics are based on his experience as a concentration camp survivor in the Second World War. So it's a very touching and very powerful melody that I will play the transcription of for you. The interesting thing in terms of the scalar discussion here is that features what you in theory refer to as double harmonic major.
Or minor.
Minor.
We'll talk about
the double harmonic major in my head just does not compute double harmonic scale. Let's call it that. And it's also known as a gypsy or a Hungarian scale. So composers like Brahms and Liszt used it consistently in their music as well. And then we also have a Bosnian sevdah, which comes from Sephardic tradition. In Europe, it was a melody, or it is still a melody that is used in Sephardic prayer, and it was adopted in Bosnia into a sevda called Kadja Podjok na Benbašu, literally means when I went to Benbaša. Benbaša was a water source near Sarajevo. And then there is another one that is Serb Bosnian, called Mujo kuje konja po mjesecu, and it translates into Mujo. So Mujo is like John Smith, basically. Here's the very regular name. Mujo is shoeing his horse under the moonlight, and it features some interesting scales that Dr. Sherrill is going to talk about in a second. And then the fourth one that we will discuss today is Macedonian Girl, which is sort of based on the idea of perpetuum mobile. There's a constantly moving 16th note pattern, but the meter is very, very interesting. It's conceived in groups of 3s and 4s, but sometimes goes into 5s and 6s and 7s. Very, very complicated rhythmic counterpoint throughout. So I'll hand it over to you.
Sure.
And I will come back to play little bits and pieces, and then if we have time, I'll play the Bosnian sevda, which by the way comes from Arabic savda, which means sorrow. So it's a sad, melancholy song.
So just thinking about the time, we have until 5 o'clock, right?
Yeah, it's a 15-minute.
Feels like we've already talked. How would you feel about starting with Kadja Podjok? Just hearing some music.
Sure. What about maybe the beginning of the Macedonian Girl?
That would work. That would work too. I just my instinct is let's have some music in our ears before I give
Sure.
a dry theory lecture for a while.
Would you? I can play the Bosnian sevda first.
Whatever your preference is.
Sure.
Since we probably won't have time for all of them. Whatever.
Okay. Music in our ears is always a good idea, I think.
talk today, I'm going to be introducing a number of unusual scales or non-classical scales. But as a way in, I kind of want to just demonstrate a couple things using familiar scales. So here on the screen I've written the D major scale, just abstractly as a scale. And by starting this on the note D, I'm representing that I'm thinking of D as the tonic. So obviously real music doesn't usually just play up and down a scale, always starting on the first note of the scale. But we represent a scale simply this way, saying that wherever you start, that's kind of the main note of the piece. That's the note that the music is going to resolve to. And so, as you may know, in common practice classical music, like Baroque, classical Romantic era stuff, basically you've only got two possibilities. You can have the major scale or the relative minor scale. But if you're familiar with other musical styles, you may have heard of the so-called Greek modes or the diatonic modes, which could take any of the notes of this scale and turn it into a tonic. So, for instance, I could take this same collection of notes and rotate it so that it starts on F sharp. Exactly the same group of notes, and whenever I sort of rotate them around like this, I'm emphasizing that it's the same notes, I'm just choosing to emphasize a different note from within the scale. And so if I take this group of notes, but I emphasize F sharp as the tonic, that gives us a scale or tonality that's known as F sharp frigid. So when I sort of rotate the notes around in this kind of animation, what I'm doing is I'm showing you it's the same notes but a different tonic. Now I could take a scale like this and I could transpose it so that instead of having F sharp as the tonic, I have D as the tonic. Same pattern of intervals, so it's still a frigid scale, but now I would call this D frigid. And it's useful often to keep the tonic the same between two scales. So comparing D major and D frigid like this. So here, if I'm emphasizing D, and I think the useful thing about that is if I think about the contrast between D frigid and D major, probably you've got the D major key signature memorized. You know that there's an F sharp and a C sharp. And in contrast here, you see that there's an E flat and a B flat. So it's kind of like D minor, but the note that stands out is E flat, giving us a flat scale degree 2, which is kind of the characteristic unusual sound for the frigid mode. I'm not sure how familiar all of that is. There's probably some of you who've done this every day of your life for years. I don't know, maybe some of you haven't seen it before. But that's going to be basically the kinds of scale relationships I'm going to be talking about. Again, rotations like this, which show that the notes stay the same. I'm just choosing to emphasize a different one from within the scale. And then shifting vertically like this, which is going to be a literal transposition. So these are both frigid scales with a half step from the tonic to the second note of the scale. Does that sort of make sense? All right. So one of the scales that's really prominent in a lot of music across the world, including several of the folk song arrangements that we're dealing with in our project today, is a scale called the Phrygian dominant scale, which starts from Phrygian, like I'm showing right here, but it modifies the scale with one extra accidental. It adds a sharp to scale degree 3, which takes us from a scale that has a minor tonic triad to a scale that has a major tonic triad. And it gives us that kind of sound, which I think sounds pretty cool. And a lot of composers generally have thought that this is a really cool sounding scale. One thing that makes it sound kind of neat is the augmented second between E flat and F sharp, which to Western European ears, because it's not an interval that classical melodies use very often, Western composers have often used it as a way to represent some kind of other from elsewhere in the world. Often that means Jewish people or Middle Eastern people or Romani people, but basically anybody that's not just like a a white Christian European gets represented by this scale, kind of regardless of whether their music actually uses this scale or not. Arabic music, Romani music does use it, but maybe not to the extent that classical musicians have used it to depict them. So that augmented second is, I think, one thing that makes Phrygian dominant sound really cool as a scale. But I think there's more to it than just that, because you could come up with any random group of notes that would have an augmented second. What's kind of special about this one right here? Well, one thing that's special about it is that this is a mode or rotation of a scale that does exist in classical tonal music, harmonic minor. So here on the screen I'm showing you exactly the same group of 7 notes, but now I'm thinking of G as the tonic. That's a scale that if you practice an instrument, you'd probably have to practice, because classical music does use this particular rotation or mode of the scale. So one reason that classical composers, classical composers have liked Phrygian dominant is it's like just exotic enough to sound familiar but sound cool. Now that tells us why classical composers in the European tradition might be interested in this scale, but it doesn't tell us why other musical cultures who don't have the same tonal biases also found it useful. And I think one thing that is just structurally useful about Phrygian dominant as a scale is that it has the perfect amount of contrast between the notes in the scale. By which I mean, some of the notes in the scale sound very low. They sound like they have minor or dark intervals above the tonic. So above D, we've got a minor second and a minor sixth. So those notes make the scale sound kind of dark. They have very low notes, but we also have one very bright note, one note that's relatively high compared to the tonic, and that's the major third. So we've got contrast between the brightness of some notes and the darkness of other notes, which, for mathematical reasons that I'm not going to torture you with, kind of balance each other out almost perfectly in this particular construction of the scale. And so this collection of notes turns out to have 2 potential tonics that work out a lot more nicely than all the other tonics in the scale. There's treating D as the tonic, which gives us Phrygian dominant, and there's treating G as the tonic, which gives us good old harmonic minor. And those are kind of the 2 most stable or most like gravitationally attracted tonic chords that you can have in the scale. And I think one of the things that makes this particular scalar structure kind of interesting to play around with musically is that both tonics have a gravitational pull. Kind of related to how relative major and minor also kind of have pulls in classical tonality. And a lot of music plays around with or experiments with that possibility, to hear it as a minor scale or as a major scale. This is kind of a well-known psychological phenomenon that you can come up with different examples of, but one that's famous in philosophy is the so-called dovet, the duck rabbit, where this picture, you can look at it either as a duck, if you think of it like, here's the eye, but like that's the beak of the duck, right? So a duck looking to the left. But you can also imagine it as a rabbit, where that's the eye, there's its cute little mouth with its nose, and this stuff over here is like the ears of the rabbit, right? So depending on which way you think it's facing, it can be 2 different animals. The harmonic minor or Phrygian dominant scale is kind of the same thing. Psychologists sometimes say that it's bistable. It has 2 different ways that you can relate to it, both of which feel meaningful, but which kind of negate each other. Like something can't be a duck or a rabbit. A scale can't be both major and minor, it has to be one or the other. And in some ways, this particular scale does that better than the classical major scale does. If we go back to D major, in classical tonality, we sort of say, well, you've got major and minor keys, and that's it. But actually, that's not it. Like, you could take almost any one of these notes and treat it as a tonic, and that would give you the different diatonic modes. If you know anything about the modes, there's only one mode that's considered to be bad. That's the Locrian mode, which would treat C sharp as the tonic. So the major scale is actually really easygoing. It can actually have a bunch of different modes. They're all relatively stable. Whereas this guy really gravitates towards just two notes, D or G. So that introduces one family of scales that you'll hear a lot if you listen to music from this region of the world, if you listen to the arrangements that we've been working with. But it's not the only scale that can do this. There's another family of scales, which is even more cool sounding. If you start from frigid dominant and you modify one extra note, you raise the leading tone from frigid dominant. That is, I've added a C sharp to the scale. Now we get something that sounds like this. Like that. This is what's sometimes called the double harmonic or double harmonic major scale. The major here is because, again, it's still a major tonic triad. The tonic is still D major. It's called a double harmonic scale because it has two augmented seconds. It's got the augmented second from E flat to F sharp. That's one augmented second, but it's also got one from B flat to C sharp at the top of the scale. And so, building from the kind of shaky premise that the thing that makes harmonic minor distinctive is its augmented second, this is kind of like twice the fun of harmonic minor because it's got two of those augmented seconds. Hence the double harmonic label. But just like frigid dominant and harmonic minor have two possible tonics that have equal gravitational pull, so does the double harmonic scale. Here we're looking at the double harmonic major scale, but we can also rotate it so that we think of G as the tonic. And here, same collection of notes, but it sounds pretty good treating G as the tonic too. And this one, it's still double harmonic because we've got those two augmented seconds from B flat to C sharp and E flat to F sharp. But now our tonic triad, starting on G, is a minor triad. So again, you have this kind of bistability where it can be major or minor, not really both at once. And just for the sake of comparison, I can transpose this down to start on D. So here's what D double harmonic minor sounds like. And so it starts sounding like regular minor, but then it has G sharp, sharp 4, kind of a double neighbor around 5. And then the top tetrachord of the scale sounds like regular old familiar harmonic minor. So that's the minor rotation of the double harmonic scale. And just like pieces can play with the ambiguity between harmonic minor and frigid dominant, pieces can play with the ambiguity between double harmonic minor and double harmonic major. So maybe now would be a good opportunity to hear some of the beginning of Jellum, which is a piece that plays with exactly this ambiguity, changing the relationship between the tonic and the defining augmented seconds of the scale. So do you think we could hear maybe the first page or so of Jellum? And so within this, in the first measure of this piece, we get basically a D natural minor motive. first measure uses almost all of the notes of D natural minor. We don't use E in measure 1, unless I missed one somewhere. But it feels like that's just accidental. Like, I'm pretty sure that's the scale that our inner ear is imagining when we hear that first measure. But we start to hear some contrasts in measure 2, where all of a sudden, second half of the measure, over that D pedal in the bass, we're hearing A, G sharp, F natural. So we've got one of those augmented seconds. Now, do you remember which scale it was that that we looked at that had that kind of distinctive sharp 4 contrasted with natural 3? It's double harmonic minor. In fact, I probably still have it up on this window, right? D minor with the sharp 4. That's kind of what we're hearing in that measure. But we don't stay stably in that scale for long in this piece. Beginning of measure 3, the left hand still gives us the G sharp, but we start to move away from it with this B natural. And then the right hand actually neutralizes G sharp to G natural. And then in measure 4, still keeping D as the tonic, now we've actually put the augmented seconds in a different location, A flat to G sharp, but I think, or G flat, but I think we're hearing that it's F sharp. To me, that sounds like we're getting the flavor of frigid dominant or double harmonic major. So here, even in this first page of the arrangement, we've actually explored both of the possible rotations or modes of the double harmonic structure, double harmonic minor and double harmonic major. So, I think that's probably all that I have to say about Jellum. We have a little bit of time to hear another performance in full. Did you want to play?
Did you want to talk about Makedonsko, Sherrill, the other two?
Yeah, certainly.
Maybe we can do that first, and then if there's time, I'll play the whole thing for you guys.
Okay. So. Actually, well, the Makedonsko Devojče is, the interest there is largely in terms of the rhythm. So maybe it would make the most sense to kind of finish off with the scale stuff.
Okay.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jellum now.
So let's just hear all of Jellum.
Sounds nice.
okay with you.
We have 5
We spent
minutes.
the last 5 minutes. So, this is probably not familiar to most of you, but one way to think about the relationships between different modes of a single scale structure is to represent them in something called a brightness graph, where here on the screen, if you're familiar with these terms, you'll recognize that like Locrian, Phrygian, Aeolian, Dorian, those are all different Greek modes or diatonic modes. And so underneath each name of the mode, I've written using numbers showing what the notes of the scale are. So for example, Ionian up near the top of the screen, if you think of the 0 in Ionian as representing the tonic, 2 means 2 half steps above the 0, 4 means 4 half steps above the 0, 5 means 5, and so on. So we've got 0, 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, and then you would complete the octave. If you're a guitarist, I think this feels really intuitive. If you've taken 3550 post-tonal theory, this might feel a little bit familiar. But basically it's a way of showing the notes in a scale without using music notation. And what I've done here is I've arranged the 7 different modes of the scale from ones that have very low notes at the bottom, what some people would call very dark scales at the bottom, to very high notes, very bright scales up at the top. So, for example, the Locrian scale, its tonic triad, its tonic triad is a diminished triad, which is kind of the darkest, the most angsty triad that you can have in the diatonic scale. The 3 scales above that, Phrygian, Aeolian, and Dorian, are the 3 scales that have minor chords, and then above that are the 3 diatonic modes that have major chords. So sort of going from the bottom to the top, you get darker chords to brighter chords within the scale. And like I said, the diatonic mode is kind of the only bad mode is the one at the very bottom, Locrian. It's the only one with an unstable tonic triad. If we wanted to visualize the relationships between scales, the modes of harmonic minor, for example, the relationships get a lot more complicated, and we don't have time to talk about what the arrows are. But so in this representation of the modes of harmonic minor, this one right here that I've labeled with the Roman numeral 1, that's the harmonic minor mode that we're familiar with from classical music. Phrygian dominant is this one right here, which I've labeled with the Roman numeral 5. And you can see that those two modes, which are sort of the ones that have like a gravitational center to them, are the ones that are kind of equally balanced between bright and dark. They're kind of the most central to the structure of the scale. They're the ones that aren't like too bright or too dark. Similarly, if we think about the modes of the double harmonic scale, we'll find that the 2 modes that actually get used in music are the ones that are, again, fairly central to this kind of abstract graph. So the one that I've labeled with the Roman numeral 1 right in the center, that's double harmonic major. And the one that I've labeled 4, just to the right of it, is double harmonic minor. And so it's kind of those 2, right in that position, pretty much exactly where Phrygian dominant and harmonic minor were, that in the structure of this scale are again the ones that have kind of the gravitational center. And you might ask, well, the other one that's a little bit central here, I think is the one labeled with the Roman numeral 5 over on the left. What would that sound like? Kind of wild, actually, but I think it's pretty cool. I think one reason that this one you don't find used in as much music is the tonic triad here is something that you don't really have a common name for. It's got a major 3rd, but a diminished 5th. Sounds kind of sweet, actually, but
Isn't that the Simpsons theme?
it's, yeah, I guess you could say it's like, the thing is, in the Simpsons theme, that tritone